one has to reflect on what the Buddha actually meant in the profound teachings of karma that are fairly sophisticated and deep. And the point seems to be that we are empowered and we have responsibility. By our actions in any moment, we have the power to change our reality and the reality all around us. Even in what looks like a very bleak situation, with good, right speech, right conduct, and a good heart, we can actually make a big difference, even if it doesn't look like it, on any occasion. So I think that's the main thing. It's not just a matter of believing something or doing something religious. It's all of our conduct of body, speech, and mind makes a big difference. That's really the burden of the teaching of karma, and that was the way that the Buddha distinguished his teaching from the teaching of other pundits, of his age. That he really took seriously all the actions of body, speech, and mind as empowered actions that could be for the good or could be for the bad, and it's your choice in any moment. So practice was about seeing that choice, being wise enough to make a good choice for yourself in the whole world. So that's really the burden of karma. And then there's all kinds of other sort of pre-existing, more or less fatalistic Indian ideologies that got mapped onto it, and it becomes a kind of a mixed bag. But I always felt like, in my understanding, that's the main point of the Buddhist teaching on karma. And I think it is very beneficial for oneself as a practitioner when there's suffering and when you're beset by some kind of ills, to take that on not as your fault, or because the person who accrued that karma in a past life literally isn't you, right? It's not you. That person is gone. So to say I in a past life did a bad thing, so I deserve this, is completely a misunderstanding of the whole Buddhist thought about what is a person, right? So it's not a matter of it's my fault, but it is helpful, clearly, to embrace our suffering and say, this is really happening. This is my karma now, my fate, my challenge. What am I going to do with it? Rather than, this shouldn't have happened to me, it's somebody else's fault, let's find somebody to make this go away as soon as possible. Those strategies for dealing with difficulty are, fairly unsuccessful. They only make the difficulty worse and worse and worse. Whereas if one says, this is my life now, I completely embrace this difficulty and I find a way to practice with it. So anyway, that seems to be what's being said here. Yes, you follow this teaching, and yes, people are condemning you for it. Be grateful and make use of that difficulty that you're having. Realize that it could be a lot worse, and there's a way of understanding this and having it take you to the enlightenment of Buddhas. It will, if you can understand this contempt on the part of others and not condemn them for it, and not resist them, but take it on, you can attain the enlightenment of Buddhas. Subhuti, I recall in the past, during the countless infinite kalpas before Dipankara Tathagata, the Arhan, the fully enlightened one, I served 8,400,000 million trillion other Buddhas and served them without fail. Nevertheless, Subhuti, although I served those Buddhas and Bhagavans and served them without fail, in the future, in the final epoch, in the final period, in the final 500 years of the Dharma-ending age, the body of merit of the person who grasps, memorizes, recites, and masters such a sutra as this, and explains it in detail to others, will exceed my former body of merit, not by 100-fold, or 1,000-fold, or 100,000-fold, or 1,000,000-fold, or 100,000,000-fold, or 1,000,000,000-fold, or 100,000,000,000-fold. Not by that much, but by an amount that cannot be measured, calculated, illustrated, characterized, or even imagined. Subhuti, if I were to describe this noble son or daughter's body of merit, the full extent of the body of merit this noble son or daughter would thereby produce and obtain, it would bewilder or disturb people's minds. Furthermore, Subhuti, inconceivable and incomparable is this Dharma teaching spoken by the Tathagata, and inconceivable is the result you should expect. So, that's another extravagant passage where the sutra, as many times throughout the sutra, it claims its own virtue, and compares it to all the other. The greatest virtue of all in the conventional Buddhist world is serving Buddhas. If you could serve a Buddha, and take care of that Buddha and venerate them and so on, this is like the biggest good karma that there could possibly be. So now Buddha's saying, and I did this trillions of times, and I got a lot of merit by that. But if you would memorize this sutra and recite it, and it would be so much more than that I can't even tell you. Your eyes will fall out and your ears will smoke will come out of your ears if I even told you how much it was. That's how hard it is to imagine. So the sutra here is promoting itself and also, in a way, kind of overthrowing, the conventional wisdom of ordinary Buddhism and saying, actually, the most important thing is not these good acts of devotion and karma. The most important thing is really sharing, because we talked about this a couple weeks ago, sharing this teaching of emptiness, in which there's liberation. There's nobody to serve and nothing to be served. No serving. There's just this boundless, free, good news of reality as it is. So the sutra repeats this many, many times. 17. Again, the Venerable Subhuti asked the Buddha, Bhagavan, if someone sets forth on the Bodhisattva path, how should they stand? How should they walk? And how should they control their thoughts? And remember, this is exactly what Subhuti asked toward the beginning of the sutra. And that's when the Buddha said, you should give rise to a thought that is unsupported anywhere. Remember that? Maybe not. But anyway, it said that. Here the Buddha answers differently. Subhuti, someone who sets forth on the Bodhisattva path should give birth to this thought. In the realm of complete nirvana, I shall liberate all beings. And while I thus liberate beings, not a single being is liberated. And why not? Subhuti, a bodhisattva who creates the perception of a being, cannot be called a bodhisattva. Neither can someone who creates the perception of a life, or even the perception of a soul, be called a bodhisattva. And why not? Subhuti, there is no such dharma as setting forth on the bodhisattva path. So this is Charlie.
Is this the first introduction of the notion of the bodhisattva?
In this sutra, you mean?
I mean, is the concept of a bodhisattva introduced into the Buddhism at this point?
You mean in this sutra, in the DiamondSutra?
Yeah.
I don't know, but I don't think so. I mean, there is, there's an idea of a bodhisattva in the earliest Buddhist teachings. The meaning of the word changed, but in the earliest teachings, the bodhisattva was a Buddha in a previous life. So a bodhisattva was always a Buddha to be. So Shakyamuni Buddha had been a bodhisattva. So the word and the concept of bodhisattva is very early in Buddhism. And I'm not the history of these ideas and so on is fairly, as I understand it, is fairly complicated and mixed up, and it's not like at the time these things were noted and written down, and when scholars go back now and try to figure out where's the first mention of bodhisattva, I think it's that most of the texts are lost, and a lot of them are not translated, and there's probably still thousands of Buddhist texts that have not been read by scholars that we know about. So this is an early text, though. The DiamondSutra is a fairly early text,
what about the notion, though, of the bodhisattva,
I don't know, but I know that the Mahayana concept of a bodhisattva, which is so takes the original concept of a bodhisattva and sort of revises it slightly,
Yes.
seems to be from the very beginning connected to the teachings of emptiness, on emptiness. Emptiness and compassion as sort of twin, sometimes they say like the two wings of the bodhisattva bird are emptiness and compassion. And I think that's true from the very beginning of the Mahayanistic tendency in Buddhism.
So this piece isn't necessarily a
It's
revolutionary
necess-
Chapter 17. It's not necessarily revolutionary? Or it is
No, I would say it is revolutionary. In other words, probably, this would be my guess, there were people teaching these things, talking about these things here and there, but this sutra was clearly a catalyst. A great literary work that crystallized, promoted, shamelessly, boldly promoted these teachings and advanced them and spread all over. So this is a very, very important text. I just don't know whether literally, it's the first mention or it invented all these things, but in a way it doesn't matter, right? I mean, it's really a really important text for crystallizing it and advancing and strengthening the movement. So all these things, emptiness, compassion, all that existed in early Buddhism. It wasn't like they were making up new things, but they really emphasized it in a much stronger way and put it in a different kind of package. And in a way, this is very bold here, they're really saying in a way, we're saying that these things that we're advancing, these ideas that we're advancing in this sutra are more important, or more fundamental and deeper than the way that you might have been viewing the teachings before. So they're really arguing with their brother and sister monastics, and they're saying, this is really, you really need to look at this. This is really different. This is really important. And they're very careful to say, and we're not making this up. The Buddha taught this. And maybe you didn't see it in the way that we're presenting it, but it's there in the earliest teachings. And we're not, early Western histories of Buddhism mapped on the Western experience onto Buddhism, where you have reformations and people saying, we reject you, In Buddhism, there was never anything like that. There was always, people were always debating the teachings based on an agreement. In other words, they were saying, this is not a new doctrine. This is just a way of understanding what the Buddha originally taught, and you should consider this. So they're very careful to base their teachings all their concepts on earlier teachings. Okay, but I think the Diamond Sutra is a really important text, and as we learn when we study the Platform Sutra, that in the history of Zen, this Diamond Sutra was seminal, for the sixth ancestor, and it was the Diamond Sutra that really crystallized the Zen school in China, and the Diamond Sutra is, a crucial text in Chinese Buddhism for that reason. Yeah, so it's really, really important. Yeah. So here, we see exactly the combination of compassion and emptiness. The bodhisattvas are all about saving beings, all about this universal desire to benefit others, but the recognition that the bodhisattva himself, herself, and the beings are empty of any separation. So that in a way, this is not a stressful, big problem to save all the beings, because saving one thought in your own mind is also saving all the beings, because there's no separation. There's no real difference. And there is no such dharma as setting forth on the bodhisattva path. It's empty of any separation, any distinction. And what do you think, Subhuti? When the Tathagata was with Dipankara Tathagata, did he realize any such dharma as unexcelled perfect enlightenment? And to this the Venerable Subhuti answered, Bhagavan, as I understand the meaning of what the Tathagata has taught, when the Tathagata was with Dipankara Tathagata, the Arahant, the fully enlightened one, he did not realize any such dharma as unexcelled perfect enlightenment. So, you could imagine an innocent, faithful Buddhist hearing that and saying, "What? What are you saying?" And the Buddha replied, "So it is, Subhuti. So it is. When the Tathagata was with Dipankara Tathagata, the Arahant, the fully enlightened one, he did not realize any such dharma as unexcelled perfect enlightenment. If the Tathagata had, then Dipankara would not have prophesied of him, 'Young man, in the future you shall become the Tathagata, the Arahant, the fully enlightened one, named Shakyamuni.' It was exactly because the Buddha did not realize any such dharma as unexcelled perfect enlightenment that Dipankara prophesied, 'Young man, in the future you will become a Buddha.' Why? Because, as we know, we've seen many, many times, because if you think there is an unexcelled perfect something, then you have a conceptual belief in something that isn't empty, and that's exactly the opposite of awakening. Awakening is exactly the recognition that there is no such thing as awakening. That is awakening. Recognizing that there's no such thing as a being, no such thing as a person, no such thing as a self. That is awakening. And then Red Pine includes a passage here that none of the other translators include, because it's in a variant text, but he decides to include it. It's this little passage that comes next. And how so? Tathagata, Subhuti, is another name for what is truly real. And the empty is what is truly real. The world as we know it is exactly what is not real. We're mixed up about things. What's really real is the empty nature of things. Tathagata Subhuti is another name for the Dharma with no beginning. Tathagata Subhuti is another name for the end of Dharmas. Tathagata Subhuti is another name for what never begins. And how so? No beginning. Subhuti is the highest truth. Subhuti, if anyone should claim the Tathagata, the Arhat, the fully enlightened one, realized unexcelled perfect enlightenment, such a claim would be untrue. They would be making a false statement. The Tathagata did not realize any such Dharma as unexcelled perfect enlightenment. Furthermore, in the Dharma realized or taught by me, by the Tathagata, there is nothing true and nothing false. And thus, I say, all Dharmas are Buddha Dharmas. And how so? Well, I think by now we all know. All Dharmas are taught by the Buddha as no Dharmas. And thus are they called Buddha Dharmas. So it's an interesting passage that he adds here about Tathagata is another name for no beginning, another name for the end of Dharmas, another name for what's truly real, another name for what never begins. So this is a little bit of a different spin on emptiness. No beginning is the highest truth. No beginning, and therefore no ending. Not the idea that it never began and it's always been going on, but the idea that since it never began, it never ends. If something never began, what can we say of it? And how could it ever end if it never begins? Or maybe it's always ending and always beginning. So this, he's saying, is the real nature of the Buddha. An appearance that never really began and never really ends, and so in a sense is endless and beginningless. So impermanence and loss is a profound illusion. And this is exactly what one says in a Buddhist funeral ceremony. No beginning, no ending, no coming, no going. A phantom body passing from this world. So the relative world is beyond the relative world. It looks like the relative world, but it's really beyond the relative world, and by the logic of the sutra, that's why we call it the relative world, because it really is beyond the relative world. And this is kind of interesting to me because it's sort of in theistic religions and in our Western tradition, religion kind of starts with a search for the beginning, the assumption that there must be a beginning. So how did things begin? Well, things began because God created them. So there's a beginning. And because there's a beginning, the binary logic of the world holds up. But it's a famous thing in Buddhism that when the Buddha was asked about beginnings and endings, specifically about beginnings and endings, he was silent. He didn't answer. And he said basically, this is not my concern. Beginnings and endings and speculation about beginnings and endings are not my concern. My concern is suffering and the end of suffering. So the implications of that, I think, are played out here in this sutra, in this passage, I mean. Suffering comes from beginnings that we believe in, which therefore imply endings that bring us tears. So the real nature of things is that they are beginningless and endless. So there's something else going on, more profound than our relative emotions about things that come and go. So that's what the meaning of the word Tathagata, which is an epithet for Buddha, it means, no beginning and no ending.
Like the term unborn.
Yeah, unborn. Yeah, unborn. Right.
Does that mean there's no creation myth in Buddhism?
No, there is no creation myth in Buddhism.
Well, I've got this mental image of, I think, all the different realms,
Yeah,
and you get continually
yeah,
cycled through them.
yeah.
But I thought you ultimately moved up to a higher realm or something like that.
No, if according to that way of looking at it, you don't move to a higher realm. You stop cycling, and so all the realms are just, they're different, and some look better than others from a relative point of view. But ultimately, the goal is not to get to a better realm or a higher realm, and it does go in a circle, right? It doesn't go higher; it just goes round and round and round and round. So what you want to do, this is the early Buddhist notion, is what you want to do is stop going round and round in circles and release from that repetitive bind. So, Subhuti, imagine a perfect person with an immense perfect body. And Buddha said, this perfect person, whom the Tathagata says has an immense perfect body, has no body. Thus it is called an immense perfect body. So it is Subhuti, the Buddha says. And if a bodhisattva says, I shall liberate other beings, that person is not called a bodhisattva. And why not? Subhuti, is there any dharma as a bodhisattva, such dharma as a bodhisattva? No. And beings, Subhuti, beings are said by the Tathagata to be no beings. Thus are they called beings. And thus does the Tathagata say, all dharmas have no self, all dharmas have no life, no individuality, and no soul. And when you read this, you could see how people thought this was nihilistic. It sounds kind of like bleak. What? No dharmas, no life, no soul, no nothing, no individuality. But maybe to get the sense of it better, we could say it like this. And thus does the Tathagata say, all dharmas have no limiting suffering self. All dharmas have no limited suffering life. All dharmas have no limited suffering individuality. No limited suffering soul. The no part that's put before each of these words stands for liberation, freedom from the constrictions and restrictions of person, being, dharma, life, soul. Subhuti, if a bodhisattva should thus claim, I shall bring about the transformation of a world, such a claim would be untrue. And how so? The transformation of a world, Subhuti, the transformation of a world is said by the Tathagata to be no transformation. Thus it is called the transformation of a world. Subhuti, when a bodhisattva resolves, commits herself to selfless dharmas, as selfless dharmas, the Tathagata, the Arhat, the fully enlightened one, pronounces that person a fearless bodhisattva. Selfless dharmas meaning empty dharmas, non-dharmas, no dharmas. So there's a lot of repetition, and it's by this time, by chapter 17, we are beginning to get the idea that this sutra is almost like an incantation or a spell, more than it is a reasonable argument about something or a doctrinal argument, which is why I asked Chris last week to just read it, read it with that sort of incantatory, trance-like spirit, because it may be that the repetition and the ongoing just speaking over and over again of this logic and of these teachings is meant to be like a mantra. And the Heart Sutra ends with that funny line, this is the greatest mantra. It's the greatest magic spell. Emptiness is the greatest magic spell. So the sutra is always exhorting everybody to memorize and recite the teaching. Power of repetition and drilling, chanting, it kind of gets into your heart. It really, it's not going in through the head, it's going in through the heart and through the gut, repeating and chanting and contemplating through music and sound. So in chapter 18, I'm going to just go to the end of this chapter on page 20. What do you think, Subhuti, if there were as many rivers as all the grains of sand in the great river of the Ganges, and as many worlds as there are grains of sand in all these rivers, would there be many worlds? Yes, many. And as many beings as there might be in those worlds, I would know their myriad streams of thought. I would know all their thoughts. And how? Streams of thought, Subhuti, what the Tathagata speaks of as streams of thought, are no streams. And that's why they're called streams of thought. And how so? A past thought cannot be found. It's true, you thought something yesterday. Where is it? Yesterday maybe like you changed your clothes and you put them in the dirty clothes hamper. You could probably find them today. But yesterday's thought you can't find. Where is it? Nor can a future thought be found. Nor can a present thought be found. Because consciousness is unfindable. So, this is how the Buddha knows everybody's thoughts. Not by reading people's minds exactly in the usual way, but through the profound understanding of the nature of consciousness. Now, so consciousness is, because you can't find a past thought, a present thought, or a future thought, it means that consciousness is exactly empty. You can't hold a piece of consciousness and say, there it is, I've got it. And of course the trick is that that's true of everything. Even the clothes in your hamper you actually can't find. It just looks like you can find them. It's kind of a very convincing illusion. But in reality, if you had an electron microscope and tried to find your clothes, you'd see that they weren't there. In the gross, coarse level of human perception, they seem to be there. But really and truly, it's quite problematic. What is basic physical reality? It becomes problematic. There's a lot of space, and the particles might not be there. We don't know they're there, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's often in the Bodhisattva path, one of the kind of persistent concepts is, and often spoken about, is the omniscience of the Buddha. And this is kind of what it's talking about here, the omniscience of the Buddha. And it doesn't mean that the Buddha reads minds. It means that the Buddha, in deeply appreciating the nature of consciousness, understands reality, understands all of us, understands who we are, and what is really important, and what is really motivating, and what is really healing. So in that sense, the Buddha is omniscient. And it's a sort of you get a feeling for the deep benevolence of the Buddha, because it's one thing for someone to be kind and clueless, is not so good as kind and really, really embracing and understanding. So one wants to be understood, and the Buddha is the one who understands, because it really knows what's most salient and most important about us. So I'm going to chapter 21. So the Buddha is constantly in the dialogue with Subhuti to kind of clarify the teachings here, and now he says to the Subhuti, do you think it occurs to me I'm teaching a dharma? No, it doesn't occur to you that you're teaching a dharma. The Buddha said, Subhuti, if someone should claim that I'm teaching something, this would be untrue. This would be a misconception. Why? Because in the teaching of a dharma, there is no such dharma to be found as the teaching of a dharma. And then hearing this, the Venerable Subhuti said to the Buddha, will there be any beings in the future, in the final epoch, in the final period, in the final 500 years of the Dharma ending age, who hear such a Dharma as this and believe it? And we've seen that before. This is now repeating this idea of, will there be people in the Dharma ending age, in a decadent age, who could understand this teaching? And the Buddha said, neither beings Subhuti nor no beings. And how so? Beings Subhuti, beings are all spoken of by the Tathagata Subhuti as no beings, thus are they called beings. So there's no hard and fast doctrine, there's no truth that the Buddha is upholding as such. Instead, the Buddha is articulating a sense of how life is. Fleeting, free, and empty of any limitation that causes suffering. It's not a particular teaching that he's giving, it's a flavor, a feeling for life that he's trying to get across in a way by defeating all teachings rather than positing a teaching. In other words, reality is inherently love. Everything is inherently sharing and mingling and mixing and freely aiding everything else. But not as a doctrine or a concept, but as a feeling for living. And are there beings who can hear and understand this? There are, but they're non-beings in the sense of not separate, not limited, not apart. They are this. You see, we are this. It's not like we're going to understand this as if it were not us. We are this already. And you know, this is, by now, we just, in this little piece of the sutra we're doing tonight, we see this pattern of the Buddha, in a way, never answering a question with any kind of statement. Every answer to every question is a undoing of the question. So the Buddha never takes any question at face value, never accepts the terms of the question as if they were actually so, because the terms of the question always imply non-emptiness. So the Buddha has to not answer the question, but simply point out the implications of the question and undo it. When I was recently in New Mexico at the Upaya Center there, they use the Heart Sutra translation of Kaz Tanahashi. And Kaz has the idea that the word shunyata, which is always translated as emptiness, should be translated as boundlessness. So it's fun when you chant the Heart Sutra there, they say all dharmas are boundless. In boundlessness there is no eyes, no ears, and so on. Boundlessness rather than emptiness. And I think, you know, certainly whether you use that word or not as an exact translation of shunyata, it's certainly what the word implies. It's not, clearly not telling you that things don't exist. It's telling you that the limitations in things are imposed by our conceptual minds and are not real, not fundamentally real. Furthermore, chapter 23, furthermore, Subhuti, undifferentiated is this Dharma. Undifferentiated. There are no distinctions, there are no limitations, there are no separations. That's why it's called unexcelled perfect enlightenment. Without a self, without a being, without a life, without a soul, undifferentiated is this unexcelled perfect enlightenment by means of which all auspicious dharmas are realized. And how so? Because auspicious dharmas are no dharmas, which is why they're called auspicious dharmas. So all the distinctions that we make that make the world sensible to us, because we couldn't even literally get out of bed and take one step without distinctions and differentiations. So they're all provisional, relative, and illusory. But we need them, because that's our life. And yet, when you think about it, that is exactly the source of all suffering. All suffering comes from distinctions, separations, divisions. Because suffering comes because something happens that we really don't like. It really bothers us. And all liking and disliking depends on distinctions. This is one thing, that's another thing. I like this one, I don't like that one. There's suffering there. Without that, there's no suffering. And so we have to admit that, you know, we will always be moved by distinctions. Being a person is exactly that, right? Being a person is not being another person, being this person. So we will never live a human life beyond distinctions. And yet, the sutra is trying to point out to us, by its relentless, incantatory logic, that in addition to those distinctions, there's another side to our human life. On the one hand, you know, I am myself, and myself alone, and you are you, and you alone. And on the other hand, we are joined together, and we are joined with everything in being. And the problem that we're having in this life is we're not recognizing that part of it. We're only recognizing the relative part of it. And so, with no let up from the other side of what we are, and only the distinctions, there's a lot of strife and trouble. We forget about the inherent boundlessness of our lives. And if we remember that, and if we can feel for that part of our lives, then, even while we're suffering, there can be some relief, even in the middle of the suffering. So it's not that we're going to suddenly stop making distinctions or stop being human beings. It's just that we're only seeing the half of it. And we're not seeing, really the most important half, and the half that liberates us. And so that's the job that this sutra is taking on, is to really hammer away at us until finally maybe we have to just give up and say, okay. I think I get it. Let me try to live it now. So, chapter 25. What do you think, Subhuti? Does it occur to me? I rescue beings. Surely, Subhuti, you should hold no such view. And why not? The being does not exist who is rescued by the Tathagata. If any being were rescued by the Tathagata would be attached to a self. So this is interesting, because we think, well, I won't be attached to myself. I'll be attached to all these people that I love. Then I'll be selfless. But actually, that's not really true. What happens is you just sort of, displace the attachment and the clinging from yourself to another, and it's actually the same thing. So, knowing that there's no one to be rescued, knowing that all others and oneself are empty, there's no clinging, no attachment to a being, a life, a soul. Attachment to a self, Subhuti, is said by the Tathagata to be no attachment, yet foolish people remain attached. And foolish people, Subhuti, are said by the Tathagata to be no people. Thus are they called foolish people. The sutra is relentless. will not miss a beat anywhere. So there are no beings to save, and yet we take this vow, as we will after we're done talking tonight, to save all sentient beings. We do this as a commonplace of our practice. So when we say sentient beings are numberless, I vow to save them, we are not imagining someone else that we're going to save, who needs our help. And we're not imagining ourselves as heroically going forth and saving others with our tremendous self-sacrifice and altruism. So why would we chant this vow? Seems like, why chant it? Because the vow expresses our attitude and our spirit, even though we don't think there's anybody out there separate from us who needs our help. And even though we don't think of ourselves as great heroes going out and saving everybody, we do cultivate and hold dear to our hearts a spirit of loving others and wanting to have this sense of concern and helpfulness. I was just talking to somebody this afternoon who was going forth in his life to be a bodhisattva, and he really was going to live out this vow of sentient beings are numberless, I vow to save them, and he decided he would do it with kindness and try to help people and really guide people and mentor them and all this stuff at work, and he found it exhausting. Exhausting. And he said, I think when I change jobs, I'm not going to do that anymore. It was too tiring, it's too much for me. And it was interesting. Then he himself said, but maybe what happened there was I just transposed my previous ambition to become, more important at work. I just transposed it over into my ambition to save a lot of people and be a good mentor and be a good bodhisattva. And maybe actually I wasn't really practicing that vow after all. So there's nothing to it. In other words, we don't think of ourselves as saving sentient beings or helping anybody at all. But we do want to cultivate the spirit of helpfulness, and we do want to all our actions of body, speech, and mind. We want them to be as much as we can in the spirit of the vow, but with no one to save and nothing to be saved, and no person who saves. So that there's only the spirit, the eagerness to evidence that kind of activity, and no exhaustion. No credit, no exhaustion, no failure, no success, just the spirit of going on with the concern and love for others. Beings are not differentiated from us. In emptiness, it's one being or no being. So, as the sixth ancestor says in the Platform Sutra, when we read it, I'm always impressed with the line where he says that saving all sentient beings just means saving this thought in your mind, having this thought be a peaceful thought in your mind. This is saving all sentient beings. So, of course, living in the world as we do, meaning having a body, we're going to do things in the outward world, but we don't need to do them with pressure, with limitation, with separation. In chapter 27, the Buddha says, furthermore, Subhuti, someone may claim those who set forth on the Bodhisattva path announce the destruction or the end of some dharma. Subhuti, you should hold no such view. And why not? Those who set forth on the Bodhisattva path do not announce the destruction or the end of any dharma. And I think this is a direct answer to those who would have thought, and it's easy to see how they would have, that what's being preached here is a nihilistic doctrine. Since there are no beings to be saved, there are no beings at all, there's no bodhisattva, there's no dharma, practice is unnecessary, do whatever you like until you die. Because what's the point? You could easily get that idea. And that was clearly the proponents of the emptiness teachings were being accused of that. So here they're saying, no, the emptiness of dharmas doesn't mean that there are no dharmas. And I think it means it in both senses. It doesn't mean that the Buddhist teachings are not right, and it doesn't mean that things don't exist. This is not about the destruction or the end of anything. This is about the liberation and the openness of things. Another way to translate shunyata might be openness. Boundlessness, what's boundless is completely open, right? It's open, it has no boundaries. So it's open boundaries, open borders, right? Completely open. And everything freely flows in and out. That's what's being argued for here, not that something doesn't exist or the end of something. And you might wonder, okay, I get that. So why all this negative language? Why no this, no that? Why no dharma? Why? I mean, in other words, whatever you use for the word shunyata, there's no denying that in the Sanskrit it's saying no dharma, no this, no that. The Heart Sutra says no eyes, no ears. That's what it says. Why do they express it that way? If it puts them in jeopardy of being accused of nihilism. And I think that it's expressed that way to forcefully, in the most stark way possible, militate against our tremendous human habit of asserting the existence of something and then attaching to it. As soon as we're convinced that something is there, we're immediately either attached to it or averse to it. There's no middle ground, So, it's a kind of frontal assault on our tremendous, tendency to be attached to something. Even subtly, even when we don't know it, whenever we assert the real existence of something, hard and fast existence of something, there's always a reaction to it. Always. And so that's why this strong language, it's very strong language, and it's very courageous language in a way, and it recognizes that it's very apt to be misunderstood. But I think if we used boundlessness, or we used prettier words or more positive words, we like why do we like that, right? And we don't like it so much when they're telling us no this, no that, no this. It's a little bit depressing, Well, that in itself should tell us something, right? Something we like, something we don't like. There's no eyes, I'm not so sure about that. But boundless eyes, that sounds better. Now I have something that I can really, right? So there's a point to the language, I think. "28. Furthermore, Subhuti, if a noble son or daughter took as many worlds as there are grains of sand in the Ganges, and covered them with the 7 jewels, and gave them as a gift to the Tathagatas, the Arhants, the fully enlightened ones, and a bodhisattva gained an acceptance of the selfless, birthless nature of dharmas, the body of merit produced as a result would be immeasurably, infinitely greater." So this is, as we've heard before. "And yet, Subhuti, this fearless bodhisattva would not obtain a body of merit." So Subhuti says, but surely this bodhisattva would obtain a body of merit, right? After all, Buddha, you've told us how meritorious it is to hold this sutra. Surely there would be merit. And then the Buddha replies, yes, you're right, there would be merit. But without grasping. This is what's called obtaining. So, here again it becomes clear. What's being proposed then is not the non-existence of things, but the non-grasping at things. So emptiness really is ultimate, radical non-grasping. It's ultimate letting alone. Whatever we say or don't say about things, they're empty, they're not empty, it actually doesn't matter. The important thing is, do we grasp or do we not grasp? Non-grasping of anything is the path advanced here. Non-grasping of the teachings, non-grasping of the Buddha, non-grasping of our practice. We still practice, of course, but without clutching it, without being proud of it, without giving ourselves so much credit for it that we end up suffering for that credit. It's not that we're being austere here and abjuring credit. It's that we recognize that once we give ourselves credit and pat ourselves too much on the back, we're going to end up suffering. Chapter 30. Furthermore, Subhuti, if a noble son or daughter took as many worlds as there are specks of dust in a billion-world universe, and by an expenditure of limitless energy ground them into a multitude of atoms, would that be a lot of atoms? Oh yeah, that would be a lot of atoms. And why? If a great multitude of atoms existed, the Tathagata would not have spoken of a multitude of atoms. And why? This multitude of atoms of which the Tathagata speaks is said by the Tathagata to be no multitude. Thus it is called a multitude of atoms. Also, this billion-world universe of which the Tathagata speaks is said by the Tathagata to be no universe, which is why it is called a billion-world universe. And how so? And here's what I've been saying. Here's the punchline. How so? Because if a universe existed, attachment to an entity would exist. As long as we're there and we think that something else is there, there's attachment to an entity, and on that attachment comes suffering. And, not only a little personal suffering, but violence, greed, war, oppression, holocausts, conflagrations come from attachment. But whenever the Tathagata speaks of an attachment to an entity, the Tathagata speaks of it as no attachment. So even the attachment is empty. See? Because we are in danger here of setting up attachment as the one thing in the world that's not empty, right? But even the attachment, the very attachment, and all the attendant suffering is called no attachment. Thus it is called attachment to an entity. And the Buddha says, attachment to an entity is unexplainable and inexpressible, for it is neither a no-dharma nor a dharma. Still, foolish people are attached. So if a universe existed, and what this means is a hard and fast, unchanging something that we would call absolutely real. If such a thing existed, then there would be attachment to it. But there actually isn't anything like that to attach to. So what we think of as attachment and what we experience of as attachment is actually not really attachment, because to be attachment there has to be something to be attached to. That's why the Buddha says it's no attachment. It's unbelievable. It's unexplainable. It's inconceivable. If there really were such a thing as attachment, existence would be impossible. Because attachment requires an object requires it being fixed. The fixed object requires that it doesn't change. It doesn't change, it can't exist. This is more or less the logic of Nagarjuna, which we studied a while ago. So, what Nagarjuna does in his philosophical treatises is he analyzes everyday ordinary reality. He analyzes our everyday concepts. I'm me, this is the world, today came after yesterday and before tomorrow, or something like that. Our regular, everyday conceptual framework. Nagarjuna, in this unbelievably elegant way, takes the whole thing and basically says, this is illogical. It doesn't make any sense. So the reason why the logic of the DiamondSutra seems so illogical and so untenable is because we're coming from a totally different system of logic, a whole different conceptual framework, which actually doesn't make sense. In other words, conventional reality and the way that we look at life doesn't really make sense. And so, when we're presented with an unimpeachable logic of things that actually do make sense, we think it sounds illogical. We think it sounds crazy. We think it sounds like nihilism. But that's exactly what's being proposed here. There can't be a world as we understand it. It doesn't make sense. There can't be attachment as we understand it. It doesn't make sense. There can't be you and me as separate individuals paranoid of each other and trying to make sure that neither one of us steals anything from each other. This is impossible. This can't be. It actually makes no sense. Even though the whole mess we're in has to do with the fact that we all assume that. Attachment is unexplainable and inexpressible. And the pain of our attachment is just not what it seems to be. The very pain of our attachment is itself the emptiness teaching. It's the expression of the emptiness teaching. And the last chapter of the sutra. Furthermore, Subhuti, if a fearless bodhisattva filled measureless infinite worlds with the 7 jewels and gave them as an offering to the Tathagatas, the Arhans, the fully enlightened ones, and a noble son or daughter grasped but a single 4-line gatha of this teaching on the perfection of wisdom and memorized, discussed, recited, mastered, and explained it in detail to others, the body of merit produced by that noble son or daughter as a result would be immeasurably, infinitely greater. And how should they explain it? By not explaining it. Thus it is called explaining. Because you can only explain something, right? How can you explain something that fundamentally doesn't exist? All explanations are themselves emptiness by themselves. You know what I mean? There's no object beyond the explanation. So that's why an explanation is a non-explanation. And that's why we call it explaining. And that logic goes for the whole world. Everything exists as a non-itself, which is why we call it what it is. The world depends on emptiness. No emptiness. I remember once in a meeting, it was a Christian Buddhist meeting, like we were having this big dialogue, you know, and Dalai Lama was there, and he said, well, he said, I guess you could say that emptiness is kind of like God, because it's thanks to emptiness that everything exists. Which means in its non-existence, you know. If it weren't, in other words, absent emptiness, the world doesn't hold. The world can exist only because things are empty. Yeah, cute, it is cute. So then comes the famous verse in which the entire teaching, it's interesting, in a way, you know, up to this point, the Buddha has been using logic, you know, really hammering a kind of counter-logic to make his points. And here, he finally throws all that away and resorts to metaphor. And it's a whole list of metaphors. And it's a very famous verse. It's always quoted from the DiamondSutra. And here's Redpine's translation. As a lamp, a cataract. Is the word for like a rushing water the same as the word for the thing over your eye? Yeah. Well, I think it means the thing over your eye, not a rushing waterfall. As a lamp, a cataract, a star in space, an illusion, a dewdrop, a bubble, a dream, a cloud, a flash of lightning. View all created things like this. And Cohen's translation of the verse is, as stars, a fault of vision, as a lamp, a mock show, a dewdrop or a bubble, a dream, a lightning flash, or a cloud. So should one view what is conditioned. So these are all examples of things that sort of exist and sort of don't. You know, like now we can fly through a cloud in an airplane. And you always thought that the cloud was like a big cotton ball up there, but apparently it's not. You fly through it, there's nothing to it. And a star, you know, it blinks on and off, and of course the star that you're seeing might not be there now because, you know, you're seeing a million light years away. So it's a kind of illusion. And a bubble is something that's actually exists, but it doesn't have anything inside of it. That's what makes it exist, right? A bubble is a bubble because there's nothing inside of it. If you filled it up, it wouldn't be a bubble anymore. A flash of lightning, a dream, A dream is real, but it's, it's wonderful to wake up from a terrible, terrible dream. What a relief that actually wasn't happening. You know, did you ever have that experience? Oh, that was so terrifying. But guess what? I'm liberated from that. It actually wasn't happening. I mean, it happened, but not in the way that it really hurts me. Right? So it's the same thing. Our regular life is the same thing. It's happening. A bubble is there. A cloud is there. It's just not there in the way that we thought it was. And that makes all the difference. So a bubble is not nothing. A lightning flash is not blankness or blackness. It exists, just not in the way we thought. So, what a wonderful sutra. We did a good job, I think, all of us, on the sutra. And now I thought for the last few minutes that we have together that we should actually do this. We should actually accrue what we have learned is a huge amount of merit. Why, waste the opportunity? To accrue a huge amount of merit by all of us, I think, should go and look in the sutra and find 4 lines. We should find 4 lines of the sutra that we would copy, write down, memorize, if not, or not, but write it down and have it as a kind of talisman for this study of the Diamond Sutra. So if anybody doesn't have a copy of the sutra, I got 3 copies here. I've got paper and pens. So let's just take the last 10 minutes before we chant to actually peruse the sutra, and you can either do it by bibliomancy or some other method. Find 4 lines of the sutra that are the right lines, that are the salient lines for you, and write them down, and copy them out later on, and put them on a card somewhere, and put it in your house for a while as your own. These are your lines of the sutra, and good things will happen to you as a consequence.
Can it be 6 lines or 8 lines?
Well, I guess 6 lines and 8 lines would be even better, I guess.
Okay.
So anybody needs a copy of the sutra, I have 3 copies here. Here you go. And I have pens up here, and I have some pieces of paper also. There's paper and pens for anybody who needs. Oh, did it work after all? Oh, it did. Oh, that's good. What was the problem?